What needs to happen in this century is it needs to be extended to include your generation, that the people who are now between 10 and 40 years old, who will be running the country 30 years from now, that generation will be between 40 and 70 years old. And so one of the tasks is to keep the extension, bringing in more people, right? And one class of people that I think has to be brought in are the young people, because we did not get Jim Crow out of education, right? And so young people are really not constitutional people in this country for purposes of their education.
I think in order to move anything forward in our communities, everything comes back to who's making the decisions and who has the power. If we're talking about voting rights, we're talking about who gets to make the education decisions. If we're talking about voting rights, we're talking about who gets to make the Medicaid or the health disparities decisions. If we're talking voting rights, we're talking about who gets to piece up the state every year that there's redistricting. If we're talking about voting rights, we're talking about, and no matter what side of the issue that you're on, you should be engaged in that. You should, whether I agree with you or I disagree with you, I want you to be involved in the democratic process.
And so there are always attempts to limit access. That there are those who still believe that access should only be given to property owners or what they call tax-paying citizens, assuming that low-wealth individuals who work every day, majority of our population work every day, and they still qualify, a good number of them still qualify for public assistance. They pay tremendous into our tax system. But many individuals don't believe they should be afforded the same rights, the constitutional right of casting a ballot.
What made this country a democracy was everyone had the right to be heard. Well, we didn't have that right, so we were not part of the country until we gained that right, and we must preserve that right at all costs.
I think we're seeing an uptick in young people voting. You go back and look at the presidential elections of 2012 and 2008, you had some pretty decent numbers. I think the thing that concerns me when it comes to young people voting is how do they participate in local, municipal, and statewide elections. That's where your numbers drop. So that's where in the city of Jackson, where you have at least 100,000 folks of voting age, and we averaging about 30 to 35,000 folks that's voting in municipal elections that decide the direction of the city. And so when it comes to young people, I think we have to really push and convey the importance of being just as involved locally as we are nationally, because the folks that we put in office right here in our cities are the folks that make the decisions that most directly impact our quality of life and that most directly impact our schools, our churches, our individual homes, our children. And we have to really make a push to get involved in what's happening at home and make sure that we exercise the right to vote here first, and then at a national perspective second.
Well, the solutions are that first we must maintain what we've already won: voting rights, civil rights, equal protection under the law. Then we must go forward from there to the next generation of empowerment. But we stand right now on the threshold of losing what was gained when you can see Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act neutralized by the Supreme Court.
Take voter identification, for example. There has never been voter fraud in the state of Mississippi that voter ID would have prevented. And yet, we have adopted policy to implement voter ID to prevent voter fraud. But the irony of that, most of our voter fraud today and in history has always taken place with absentee balloting. And we have not adopted a policy of voter ID for absentee balloting.
This year, we will see the first elections in which voter ID is required. So at that point, hopefully, we'll get a sense empirically of what the effect is. Tens of thousands of Mississippians that do not have a photo ID that meets the standards. Most of them are African American. Most of them live in rural areas, and most of them do not have the mode of transportation. You know, a lot of these counties, they're required to go get the free photo ID, they're required to travel over 10 miles and do so within business hours Monday through Friday. And so for a lot of working people that don't have a car, don't have a reliable means of transportation, that's onerous, even if the ID itself doesn't cost any money at the point of issuance. So it does place a disproportionate burden. I don't think it's a coincidence, but some may see it as a coincidence that this comes on the heels of 2008 and 2012, in which, for the first time in Mississippi history and really American history since Reconstruction, non-white turnout was higher than white turnout. The Census Bureau estimated that Mississippi had the highest voter turnout of any state in the country, and black turnout was higher than white turnout.
Young people have opinions about things that we talk about naturally or regularly, but they have their own ways of expressing what those opinions are, and they have their own ways of finding information about those issues and developing their own stance of, you know, what they stand for and what they stand against. And in addition to listening to them, we have to encourage, through questions, young people to think deeper and respond, you know, not just to the here and now, but to think about what are some of the things that ripple out of what's happening now and the things that they're concerned about.
What we've learned is that we're not going to get anywhere if we don't include young voices at the table. You know, if you think about 64 as being, if the focus of Freedom Summer was to get folks registered, you know, there's a lot of young folks out there getting folks registered, and we're talking about getting, right now in 2013, 2014, we're talking about education equity issues that if it's not young people pushing it, then it's not going to happen.